I think we're gonna go ahead and get started. So, hello everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is JoAnna. Um, we're gonna get into our lesson 4. So, lesson 4 is gonna be on costume designing when you're designing a character. So, what is it you want your character to wear? So, when you're designing a character's costume, you want to make sure that their clothes match the environment you intend to put them in. If you want to create an adventure from a mystical world, you would most likely not see them in a tuxedo or a hard hat or even a beautiful ball gown. You're going to see them in clothes that are ready for combat or ready to fight or ready to be in the woods and to explore, something that they'll get dirty in or whatever the case may be. But they have to be prepared for their situation at hand. So, like I said, if you have an adventurer, you're not going to see them in a suit with a bow and arrow or a ball gown or a ballet dress with their weapon of choice, but you're probably going to see them in clothes ready to combat, hairstyle that matches, and usually a lot of gear to go with it. So when you're designing a character, depends on where you want to put them or what that character is intended to be doing. So with an adventurer, you're going to usually have a lot of straps, a lot of loose and or tight clothing, or sometimes some extravagant like jewelry for like a pirate character. Usually boots intended to be worn fairly regular. Or a businessman would look very sharp and very well dressed and fancy. Or a princess, you would have them in a very beautiful gown with lots of folds into the fabric and very extravagant. Usually a necklace, but I forgot to draw one. Superheroes are usually going to have a lot tighter fitting clothes for the most part, usually very colorful. They'll be usually physically stronger as well and have a lot more detail to the fabric. Or in a modern casual clothes, you're going to see a lot more folds, especially if you're wearing something looser like a hoodie. It's going to be a lot more folds in the fabric and a lot more texture in it than, say, like the superhero, who's going to have the texture you would see is more in the muscle structure underneath of the clothing over the actual folds in the clothing. And then same with the jeans or socks or shoes that you intend to put with them. Or if you're doing a soldier, it would kind of be somewhere in between the superhero and the modern comfortable clothes, where the pants will be a little bit more bulky, like, and more folds like the hoodie or the jeans, but the shirt would be probably a little bit tighter because it's on a stronger figure, so it'd be a little bit more like the superhero. And with shoes, you would have combat boots, so it'd be a lot more like the adventurer, where they'd have boots that are intended to be working in. So I didn't have a lot to go over today, so we're going to go kind of straight into drawing from there. So I have a little bit of a sketch that I did that I'm going to render a little bit better with you guys. So I figured the best drawing to kind of go over the most amount of different fabrics you will encounter when you're drawing would be a pirate, because pirates usually have a lot of different textures in their clothing that you'll probably see in most different clothings when you're drawing them. So we're just going to start out drawing the shape of the character. Which I have at a 3/4 view. And I'm just gonna build the skeletal structure so we know where to put the shapes. So then you're just gonna build. What I usually do when I'm drawing a character is, instead of, sometimes I'll draw straight into the clothing if I know exactly what it is I'm doing, but if you're not entirely sure what shape your character is exactly in, I would draw just kind of thicken out your character a little bit so you can see where the character's form is, just very lightly, so that it's not too dark to have to erase later. But this will help give you a feel of the exact position your character's in, and then where you're going to be erasing things later. I'm just gonna bulk the shoes out a little bit. All right, and then since I have already a basic thumbnail sketch of what I want my character to look like, I'm just gonna start kind of going off of that. And it's always nice to start out with a rough sketch, especially on a separate piece of paper, so that you can use it as reference if you're not entirely sure where you want those clothes to look like. You can always draw it on the thumbnail sketch, and if you don't like it, you can erase it, and it's not going to mess up your final pieces if you keep erasing the same thing and you can't get that one portion right. If you do it right on your final piece, it's going to mess up the paper over time. So I'm just going to start with the face. I'm just gonna start creating the facial expression I want on using the guidelines that I put for the face. And because of where and how her face is angled, most of the other eye is gonna be fairly off screen, or off paper, I guess. But I'm going to be mostly covering that with the hat. And if you do a hat on your character, I usually start with that before going into the hair, because that hat's going to cover most of the hair anyway. So with the pirate hat, it's going to look kind of like a taco on the top of their head a little bit, where it's going to have a more flat bottom with a very rounded top. But at the point here, instead of going all the way down to the flat edge, you're going to just make a loop back almost like a fish hook at the end to create the other side of the hat. And almost make like a very fat check mark. And it's very similar like that with a cowboy hat. Kind of similar design doing that. And then you're just going to make a dome over where the head would be to put on over the head. And then at this point, I'm going to make my way down to the shirt, which I'm going to have this character have a bit of a V-neck with a vest. And now when you're doing clothing, the clothing is going to be slightly further away from the outside figure than what your character's skin would be. So if you drew a line where the skin would be up against the character, your clothing's going to be just on the other side of that. So it's going to look like it's over the skin rather than right up against it and almost painted on. And then you're going to follow where that would go. Now I'm going to make the vest a little more form fit at the bottom, so you don't have to go away from the figure as much as at the top. And then to create folds in the fabric, usually the folds of a shirt are going to be going downwards on each side. You don't have to do too many of them, maybe usually between 3 to 5 of them, or like folds a little bit more like under the arms or along the bottom of the shirt would have a lot more folds than say the middle here or anything else. It'll have just a couple folds. And all you would do is go in from the one side and just kind of make a line going down towards the waist to create a little bit of a fold. And you can even put a couple folds at one corner so it looks like the fabric's folding in 2 different places from the same spot, which gives the character a lot of depth. Then I'm going to start next with the arms, or the sleeves, I guess. So with a pirate's sleeves, they're usually very puffy and very flowy. So I'm gonna make them a lot further away from where the character's arm actually is than what the vest would be. So when I'm drawing that, I like to create a lot more folds in the fabric for like a pirate sleeve than what I would in the vest, because the vest is going to be a little bit more form-fitting, so you're not going to have quite as many folds and it's going to be very tight against the skin. Whereas with the sleeves of a pirate, they're going to be a lot more bulky along the arm, because this is where my arm would be. But I just start making like kind of C shapes, wide C shapes that you can kind of just start building off of each other. Or even like S shapes that kind of make the fabric look like it's bunching up on itself. Because like on the bottom I can do almost squiggly lines to show where the character's sleeve would be. Now when you're doing the elbow, you're going to put a couple extra creases in where the elbow would be to make it look like the fabric's bunching around where you would be bending your arm. Because you can already see there's a lot more crease in where a sleeve would be in the arm. And then on this character, I'm also going to do a pair of gloves. So I'll stop about halfway down the arm, and then I'm gonna make almost like a cuff. So like a cylinder to create what would be the end of a glove. And then you're gonna create a very straight line along where the figure's body would end to create the illusion of a very flat and straight leather glove. And I'm gonna make her hand closed. So with the fingers, I would say like little J's. So you're gonna do little J's next to each other. That kind of gives you a look of fingers. And I would say that's gonna be on a belt that I'm gonna put on later, which I can actually add. I would normally add that in now. Now with belts, they're going to be a lot further out than what, like the sleeve, it's going to be a lot further out than the vest. So you're going to make it stick out a little bit further than what the vest is going to be. And then because I want it to go through her hand, you're going to tuck it in behind the hand, and then it's going to come out the other side of her hand. And because of how I put her hand, it looks like the belt's going to go up a lot higher. And it's going to rest outside of the other end of her vest. Alright. Then to add a lot more detail, I'm going to do the other sleeve actually. And then with this one, because the elbow isn't bent as much, you don't have to add as many creases in this elbow as it is on the other side. And then I'm also going to put a sleeve on this side as well. Or a glove on this side as well. So I'm going to do the same thing on this hand as I did with the other hand. But instead of the hand being closed around the belt, I'm going to have this one open. So when you're doing that, what I will normally do is I will put my hand in the position that I kind of want the hand being. So I use my own hand usually as a reference to see where I want the fingers to be positioned. So I want the character kind of pointing with the thumb down. So I'll look at how the thumb is positioned on my own hand, and how the top of the hand is. And then you can add the fingers to it. although most of the other fingers aren't going to be quite as visible as the first few. So then what I'm going to be adding here is like a sash around the character, and the sash is going to go underneath of the belt, but that's also going to add a little bit more bulk than the vest would. And usually when I'm doing like an adventure character, I tend to slant the clothing, especially like belts and sashes and extra over clothing. I usually slant them from one side to the other, so like it would be bigger on the right side, well, the left hand side of the character than it would be on the other side, because it's all slanting into the one corner. I just think that's aesthetically pleasing, so I like to do that. And because on the character I have a little bit of the vest into the sash, I'm gonna just erase that so that doesn't confuse me where I'm at. And because the sash is gonna be sloping from one side to the other, all your folds are going to start pointing over towards where it's more bunched up here. So they're gonna go more all in this corner, over where the end of the belt goes. And it won't be quite as bunched up in this corner, especially since the hand is covering it. And then I'm going to add on the belt, and usually I like to add all this stuff before I get to like the pants, because a lot of this stuff will be covering the pants, so I don't want to draw the pants and then have to erase most of it just to put in what I am doing on the character. But I'm also going to have corner of the sash flow down in front of the character, so I'm going to make like a very loose S from one corner of the sash down, and then I'm gonna do a straight line and just kind of start going back up, and I'm gonna taper off at the end so it'll be closer to where that first line started than where it ended. And then because that fabric's pulling all towards the smaller point at the top, all the folds are going to start going upwards towards that folded spot. So anything that's probably tapered off to a smaller point, usually that's where your folds are going to start angling themselves, is all towards where that fabric has been folded the most. So because there's not a whole lot of folds at the end, you're going to have less at the end but more up at the top. And you can even do a handful extra folds at the top than at the bottom. And then, so for the pants with a pirate, I tend to start with the boots, because usually the boots are going to create folds in the pants over the waistline. So I usually do like a band around the or around just below the knee, kind of like how I did with the glove, where you have a band, or just like I guess the top of the boot, which it doesn't have to have a band, but I always like the look of it. And it's a little bit easier than doing some different styles of boots. But then when you get to the pants, they're going to fold over and almost look like they're tucked into the boots when we get to those. So when I'm doing boots of pirates, usually the top half closest to the cuff of the boot is going to be a lot thinner, but when you get to the end, it's going to look like it bunched up around the ankles, because usually they were leather in that time period, so they're going to look very bunchy at the end. So you're just going to start pulling it away from what the leg would be and adding some folds to the character's boots. And then with the shoe, I usually do an angle for where the heel would be. And I usually tend to start with the heel because, I don't know, that's a good starting point. When I'm doing feet, I tend to start at one point, usually consistently, so that I can just have a regular routine for how I'm starting the shoes, because when you start it at different points every time, it might start to get a little confusing. Like with some people that works. I tend to start it usually at the heel because I find that's the best part to start where your foot's going and how to point it. Which you can always do it a different way. It just kind of depends on how it works best for you. And then you're gonna go straight across, especially since the foot is profile. And when you get to the point where the top of your foot's bending, shoes are gonna bunch at that point where it's the most creased. Then at the end of the shoe, I usually do a curve backwards to kind of indicate the toes a little bit, not too much. Then with the bottom of the shoe, where you've put the bottom of that, I just do a parallel line along the bottom of it to kind of create the sole of the shoe. All right, so now to go into the pants. So with the pants, like with the sleeves, they're gonna be a lot more bunched up. So they're gonna stick out from the figure a lot more than the vest that's closer to the body. And I'm just gonna start creating lines and thicker shapes and rounded edges for the pants. And so when you get to the point where the pants would be tucked in, I usually bunch them out a little bit more and then point it in towards the edge of the boot. And then I'll do roughly the same thing on the other side, to where it looks like it's been tucked in. And then I'll have this side go up. And then when it comes to the top of the inside of the leg, you're gonna have a lot more folds on the inside of the leg because that's where your clothing would be the most creased. So those are gonna go upwards along the edge of the leg, closer to the hips. So it's gonna go more up and edge down. So you're gonna have more of like, I would say a feather look, where some folds are gonna go up, some are gonna go straight, and most of them, or not most of them, but a good amount are also gonna go down. So you're gonna have folds up, out, and down for the inside of the leg. And then you're just gonna do the folds on the outside of the leg, or the inside of the leg as well, down towards the boot. Alright. So then I'm gonna go back up to the character's head. And I'm gonna start creating curls or straight hair, whichever one you'd prefer to do. But I'm just gonna start adding some curls. And when I'm doing curls honestly are some of the harder hairstyles to do, but I usually switch between doing lines in one direction then the other direction to make the hair look a little inconsistent, kind of like curls actually are. They're very inconsistent and kind of unruly. They don't follow rules. Kind of like art. You can do whatever you'd like to and change things up and switch things around and kind of play by a loose rule of thumb. But at this point, I'll usually add some detail if I didn't already add it. Like I'm gonna add a sword, which I would just do a circle with a end to hold on to. And then I'll have the sword go straight down. And whichever direction you do the handle, it's going to be straight down from there. I need to grab a pencil. My end's not very sharp no more. Alright. And then I'll also add a bag of loot on the other side off of the end of the belt, which you're going to do just another cylinder to create like a tie where the sack of coins would go. And then I usually make like a small triangle with folds in it to make it look like the top of a bag. And then you're gonna make a half circle along the other side to create like a bag. And just add a couple folds in that to create the look of like folded bag with coins or whatever it is she may be carrying in it. But at this point, I'd probably add some like jewelry, like necklaces or big earrings, which pirates in that day probably would have, at least female ones would probably have large jewelry and have earrings where their ears would be, and necklaces and maybe some extra straps, which you can put across the body. And then at this point, you can go in and erase all of the construction lines of the character. And then if you unintentionally erase something that you didn't mean to, you can always go back in and fix that. All right, and was there any other questions before we get off here? Alright, well, if there's no other questions, I think we're done for today's lesson. So next week, we're going to be going over non-human-like characters. So anything like more mystical, like elves, fairies, things like that, where they're not quite human, but they're more human than animals. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining, and we'll see you all next week.